Now, the big question that you might have is, why maps? We already have structs, which are already key value data storages. Well, there are two main, very important differences. The first important difference is that for maps, you can use anything as a key. Here we are using strings, but you could also create a map that uses integers or even some array or a struct as a key. So any value can be used as a key. And that gives you more flexibility since you're not stuck to just using human readable text as keys, even though that is probably what you'll do very often. But you have more flexibility there. Another key difference is simply that maps solve a different problem. With structs, you have predefined data structures. For example, if I come back to that product struct, which we saw before, then we make it clear that we have an ID, a title, and a price. And that's then our product. Now, once we defined that struct, when we work with it in our code, we can't just add a new key value pair. Instead, this is set in stone, so to say. We also can't delete a key value pair from it. So these things which we can do with maps are not possible for structs. And that's not a disadvantage, instead a struct solves a different problem. It's great whenever you have clearly defined kinds of data that should have exactly this shape. Whenever you instead have a collection of values where you want to have custom labels to identify those values, a map is your choice instead. Like here for the URLs. This could be a super long collection of URLs for tons of companies, and we can expand it and shrink it just as we want with a map. It's a bit like an array. We have the same kinds of values, URLs, but we just don't want to have indexes, but instead custom labels. And that's why we use a map instead of an array. With a struct, we wouldn't have a good way of handling this. We could define a struct websites, but then there we would need to define in advance that we have Google, and that will hold a string value, and AWS, and that would hold a string value, and we wouldn't even be allowed to write Amazon Web Services like this. That would be an invalid struct key. So we would have a bunch of restrictions there, and we would simply use a feature to manage a collection of data that's not meant to be used for this purpose. You don't use structs to manage multiple values of the same kind with different keys, but instead you use structs to describe data entities in your programs. Something like a product or a user or a company or anything like that. And a map, on the other hand, is used if you have a collection of values which probably describe the same thing, though technically not necessarily, but then you can assign your own labels, your own keys, and use any kinds of values for those keys that make sense to you. So I hope I could make that clear what the difference between a struct and a map is, and why we have both, and why both solve different problems. In a nutshell, you can basically think of maps as arrays where you don't use indexes, but instead any labels of your choice.